Well, welcome all to Ottawa. I want to thank you, first of all, for having me here. I want to thank Enrico del Castello for asking me to do this. I also want to thank Claudiana Puro for being very kind to me and helping me prepare for this. I want to thank all of you for coming and for dragging with you some spectacular weather. As you know, in Ottawa, or if you don't know, I'm sure you've heard, we have 13 months of winter normally in Ottawa. And you've brought some brilliant weather with you. I'm going to declare my bias up front. I was born a few months after my parents left Italy to come to Canada, and it's been nothing short of a marvelous experience for me, for my family, and I am a believer in immigration. You have a dazzling panel here, and I'm going to call on them individually to speak to us about some of the research they're doing, research that I can tell you will be one of the hot button issues in our election campaign coming up later this year, and I think has already proven to be a hot button issue abroad. I am going to be brutal about how much time we've got, because I know some of you were on the dance floor until dawn this morning. And I'm mindful of that, but we've got some very important things to hear. And I'd like to begin with Neil, please. Neil Ruiz from the Pew Center. Please, Neil. Do you want to come up or do you want to sit? Sure.
Thank you very Thank you very much. Is the PowerPoint up? Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers for hosting me here. This is a pleasure. I haven't been to a metropolis since 2006, and it's just great to see how it has grown over the decades. So I'm going to present to you kind of our work at Pew Research Center, based on a 2018 Global Attitude Survey, where we surveyed 27 different countries around the world. Just to give you a background about Pew, we are a fact tank. We are nonpartisan, non-advocacy. We don't make any policy recommendations to keep the integrity of what the public thinks, and also our demographic work. We keep unbiased work. So these are 27 different countries. We did 27,000 interviews conducted during May to August 2018 in 31 different languages around the world. The first finding, we asked this question: immigrants today, do they make our country stronger because of their work and talents, or are immigrants today a burden to our country because they take our jobs and social benefits? You see here, Canada is #1 in terms of thinking that immigrants make the country stronger. But then you see in the very bottom, countries that experienced the 2015 refugee surge in Europe have actually a much more negative view and believe that immigrants are a burden to their country. And this is a really stark difference when you see the differences, especially in Greece and Italy. Between 2014 and 2018, there's a big change in terms of their views turning more on the negative side towards believing that immigrants are a strength. And then you see this divide ideologically. So we divided the sample looking at whether there are more ideological left, right, or center. And you can see here the United States is #1 in terms of this huge divide. We already hear about this polarization in the US, and that's been dividing the United States public. But you see in Greece at the very bottom, you see that whether they're right or left, they both agree that immigrants are more of a burden to their country. And here in Canada, actually, whether you're ideologically right or left, actually agree that immigrants are a strength. Next, we ask a question about integration. We say, are immigrants in our country today want to adopt our customs and way of life, or do immigrants today want to be distinct from our society? And you see here, Canada is actually quite split, but this probably reflects the way Canadian society is in terms of people wanting to be distinct as immigrants or wanting to adopt your ways of life. You see the US is actually the majority believe that they're adopting the customs and way of life. And then there's an anomaly, which is Japan. And I was just there last couple months ago, where they do believe that their immigrants are adopting the ways of life. But the reason why is because they have a small number of immigrants, and they do have restrictive kind of policies where they have to have language. They have to know the language. So that's why the public believes they do adopt their ways of life. Next, we ask the question, are immigrants more to blame for crime? And around the world, half or more say that immigrants are no more to blame for a crime. You see here in Canada, 80% of your public believe that immigrants are not more to blame for crime. But you do see, again, countries like Greece as well as Germany, where you see publics actually, on the other side, believe that immigrants are more to blame for crime. Then we also ask this question about deporting. So we say, thinking about immigration, would you support or oppose deporting immigrants currently living in your country illegally? Across the board, half or more countries believe in deporting the country, illegal immigrants in the country. But you see US and Mexico and Spain actually is quite divided. And when you see here by politics, by political ideology, this divide is really apparent, where you see those in the ideological left are less likely to want to deport illegal immigrants in the US, whereas those on the right do. Then we ask this question around the world, in your opinion, should we allow more immigrants to move to our country, fewer immigrants, or about the same level as we do now? Across the board, the majority of the world don't want more immigrants. But you do see in Canada, the majority want about the same level. 53% of the Canadian public want about the same exact level you have now. You see the United States, about 44%. You see countries like Japan, which is going through a demographic crisis where we have more deaths than births every day. You see them wanting the same level, at least 58% wanting about the same level. And the next question, this is I would call the Miss Universe question about high-skilled immigration. Thinking about immigration, would you want to support or oppose encouraging high-skilled people to immigrate and work in your country? And pretty much across the board, majority want to support high-skilled immigration, with the exception of Israel and Italy. And when we take the sample of those who wanted fewer immigrants, they still support high-skilled immigration. And then we ask the question on refugees. Talking about immigration, would you support or oppose taking in refugees from countries where people are fleeing violence and war? And the majorities in many countries support taking in refugees. You see this here in Canada, you see it in the United States, you see it all over Europe as well, with a few exceptions. And the last slide that I want to leave you with is a question about brain drain. We asked a question about, what about if people, is it a problem that, or moderately big problem, for people leaving for countries abroad for jobs? And you see across the board, many majorities believe that leaving for a job abroad is a problem. As in an earlier panel, you saw someone from the Philippines, you saw the mayor from the Philippines. 65% of the Philippine public believe it's actually a problem that they have to send people abroad for jobs. But what's interesting here is that the big destination countries, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, they're actually okay with people leaving. They're okay with their nationals leaving for jobs abroad. So I will leave you with that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
I want to thank Neil for being very close to keeping the time, number one. And I want to ask him a question, and I'm not sure if it's in your research, but it does seem everywhere that integration is the key to successful immigration. Is integration slower now? And are some groups better at integrating than others? And are some countries better than others at integrating immigrants? Does your research show anything on that?
It's not clear for me in terms of our research showing who's better at integrating or not. We don't have a question about that. But we can tell you is that it's interesting to see the results where I highlighted Japan, where that's a very much more homogenous society, but yet the public believes that they're integrating their immigrants, but that's because there's a small number. Whereas in other countries like the United States, they believe that everyone's adopting their ways of life, and but it's a much more diverse, multicultural society. So I don't think we have any conclusions, but it's kind of interesting to see how different countries have a different set of control of how people integrate their society.
Okay. I'm going to turn now to Rob McNeil from Compass, please. Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I've already screwed this up. Keith Newman from Environics. I apologize.
Are you set? Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for being here today and sticking around. So in the 5 minutes that I have, I'd like to speak about how Canada fits into the issue of public confidence in migration, and really from a global perspective. As we've all seen at this conference, Canada is kind of touted as a beacon of tolerance, certainly showcased here. We're certainly taking a record number of refugees, and we don't seem to have the kind of social and political tensions we're seeing in many other countries. Those of you who are visiting from somewhere else may be wondering, what is it about Canada that makes it different? And among the Canadians in the room, you may be skeptical about whether we actually deserve this reputation, or you may be concerned that it's slipping away. So what I'd like to do is kind of address both audiences and very briefly cover 3 points: our history and geography, what's distinctive or unique, Canada as it is today, and what it means for public opinion and politics. So very briefly, in terms of history, some of you may not be that familiar. We're one of several Anglophone settler countries, along with the US, Australia, New Zealand, with a history of high levels of immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries, but not without considerable restriction and racism. And all of these countries have undergone significant transformation, becoming diverse societies, but in some ways Canada has evolved excuse me, a bit more distinctly than others. Part of this is about geography, excuse me, and geography really matters. We have a large border with the USA, but separated by oceans from all of the other countries and all the other places where people might come from. So we have a very large landmass, and I might point out it's a fairly non-strategic landmass from a geopolitical point of view, and so we really have been in a position as a country to control the borders and who arrives. The other important historical fact is the historical settlement of English and French settlers along with indigenous peoples. And these influences and these peoples living in the same space along with a harsh climate has fostered what might be described as a culture of accommodation. We've all sort of tried to get along, partly for survival. So to Canada today, we are a highly urban country. Over 80% of the population lives in cities. We have a high proportion of immigrants. 42% of the population in 2016 was first or second generation. That's 4 out of 10. But if you look at Toronto, it's 8 in 10. 8 in 10 people in the Toronto area came from another country or one of their parents did. Vancouver, 70%. That's very significant. There were multicultural policies established by governments starting in the 1960s, and for the most part, these policies and programs have largely withstood political headwinds as politics have gone back and forth. And compared to some other countries, Canada has a fairly weak national identity, so to speak, so the pressure of immigrants to assimilate and integrate into a national framework, not quite as strong as others. Adrienne Clarkson, a former Governor General, has described this as benign neglect. We have political and economic institutions. We have a public education system that's supported provincially. So the level of education is largely the same across the country and has served as a very important engine of integration for first and second generation. We have a healthcare system and a social safety net that's less than perfect, but has provided some supports across the population. We have a very high rate of citizenship intake. Over 80% of immigrants become citizens, and that's very significant. And it's also important to point out that we have a fair amount of diversity, maybe not enough, in our political representation. In our federal parliament, we have 46 MPs who were born in another country. And while that may not seem like a large number, the fact that somebody can be born in another country, come to Canada, get established, be part of a community, get nominated by a political party, and then win is a fairly significant step, and I'm not sure any other country has quite that many. What does this mean today in terms of public opinion and politics? Debbie Douglas referenced some recent polls that have suggested that there are growing concerns about immigration in Canada. Our own data does not quite show the same thing. We've been tracking this fairly carefully for a number of years on a consistent basis, and we're finding that for the most part, public opinion is fairly stable over the last period of time. Canadians are broadly supportive of immigration and refugees if there's no consensus. They see immigration as benefiting the country. An increasing number of Canadians look at this as a point of pride and what makes their country unique. And so the sentiments are holding fairly steadily. There is anti-immigrant racist sentiment in this country. There always has been. And I think it probably is more visible because some of the people in that camp, so to speak, are perhaps feeling more enabled, and social media kind of builds that up. But there really lacks prominent leadership in an explicit way about leading this forward. So Rob mentioned federal elections coming up in October. I believe it will be a test of Canada's tolerance and reputation. Those people who are uncomfortable with immigration or are racist or have those sentiments have drifted and sort of went to one of the political parties, so there's been a political polarization of the population. But that party is challenged to decide whether it can actually accommodate that, because if it goes too far, it will lose a significant proportion of other voters. And I think one of the political realities in this country today is that you can't form government if you don't have some base of support somewhere in urban Canada. So with that, thank you very much.
Keith, you should be a bomb disposal expert because you skillfully disarmed every grenade that I was going to lob in your direction.
I'm sure you've got one.
No. There is a sense among some political parties that the consensus, we believe in Canadian exceptionalism, we're different than every other country, but you've pointed out that that's not entirely true. We do have racists among us. But there does seem to be a sense among some political parties that that consensus about the value of immigration is fraying. You're saying that's not the case. Why then do you think immigration is going to be one of the hot button issues during our campaign in a few months?
Good question. And I'm not a political pundit, so I don't bring that expertise. It's not as if immigration, it's not that there is a public consensus about it. There never was. And I think that it's, the polarization on the issue has been building for the past 15 or 20 years. So in a sense, Canadians have been kind of sorting themselves based on their views on immigration and other issues. And if you feel uncomfortable or negative, you are drifting to one party, and if you don't, you're drifting to another. So that is a development that's taking place. Broadly speaking, opinions are fairly consistent. So because the political bases are changing, the parties are looking at that and looking at this as either an opportunity or a threat in terms of an issue that will become an issue to battle on, the way in previous elections it wasn't. The other important point, I think, is that because this is a global issue and because of what's happening in the US and in Europe, that hasn't affected what happens in Canada. Just broadly speaking, social media and so forth. So it's up there more, and I think with social media and with other developments, I think it's things that used to be under the surface are now coming to the surface. And so I think you're right. I think this will be an issue in the election, but it's unclear how it will play out. And I think if we look back to the 2015 election and how the government played the issue and maybe misplayed the issue in terms of certain policies that backfired on them, does give us an indication that parties that want to use this issue as a wedge will have to be very careful.
Yeah, it's important to point out that the Liberal government is traditionally seen as a party of new Canadians, yes. But the Conservative government quite skillfully stayed in power by coveting and successfully convincing new Canadians to vote for them in rather large numbers. You're absolutely right in that you cannot form a government unless you convince new Canadians to support you. We'll come back to some of that during the Q&A. I think it's now safe for me to turn to Rob McNeil from Compass, and please welcome Rob.
Thank you, and I'm very grateful to the Metropolis organisers for having me here. It's a great privilege. So I work on the issue of migration in the media, and I work on that in the UK. And people consistently come up to me and say things like, wow, it's such a crazy time dealing with this. You must be so busy right now. You know, migration in the media has completely gone crazy now. And I would like to argue that this is not something which is new, and that in fact, if we can, I don't know if this, with the green, I'm pressing the green button. There we go. In fact, for as long as there has, I mean, we know that for as long as people have been on this planet, people have moved. But for as long as people have expressed themselves through means of communication, through media of communication, migration's been a fundamental story in that. I illustrate this with an image of a boat petroglyph from 10,000 BC in Azerbaijan, and a page from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which of course deal with the issues of migration consistently, that whether it be the Exodus or the story of the flight to the desert, I mean, in the Abrahamic religions, the flight to Egypt of Jesus, and then also we have things like the Hijra of Muhammad, all the way through to my current country's Daily Mail, which deals with some slightly more shocking stories about migration. But one thing that we see consistently is that the themes have not necessarily changed. They deal with issues of group identity and otherness. They deal with religious, cultural, and ethnic distinctions. They deal with ownership of territory and land. They deal with conflict over resources. And they deal with the idea of the exotic versus the normal. Now, I would also like to argue that the stories that we tell are not just about media, they're also about the rest of us. They're about public debate generally, and that essentially media, public debate, and policy making all reinforce each other. And I'd like to illustrate this with an image from the Ipsos Mori Issues Index, which is tracking the salience of migration in the UK since the 1990s. And you can see that the big spike in 2015, which relates to two things. Obviously, the Mediterranean crisis that was going on, but also you can see there's been a huge increase in the run-up to that, which was to do with the expansion of the EU, but more fundamentally, after the recession, the end of labour market controls on people coming to the UK from Romania and Bulgaria. So there was this huge, huge debate in the UK, and it became the top issue of public salience in Britain. And of course, this discussion around the inability to control migration from the EU was a pretty fundamental part of the UK's decision to leave the EU. But what I'm really interested in is what happens after we vote to leave the EU. And you can see an absolute collapse in the salience of the issue of migration as a standalone issue in the UK. It reaches its lowest point since 2001 in May of this year. Now, the reasons for that collapse are essentially that there has been a reduction in the volume of discussion, I would argue. And I think that this amplification process that happens between media, public attitudes, and public policy making is really important. Public policy makers have stopped talking about this issue. Media has stopped talking about this issue. The public are broadly saying that they're not that concerned about the issue anymore, even though we still have pretty high net migration in the UK. And as Neil's slides showed us, British people are now or Britain rather, is the country in Europe which has the highest sense that migrants are contributing to the country. Which is just astonishing for those of us who were dealing with the debate 5 years ago. Now, I think it's important to recognize that the way that media creates narratives about migration is something that we all have to think about. I've recently been doing a research project which has involved interviewing a couple of hundred journalists around the EU to look at why media narratives about the issue of migration are so different in different European countries. Now, obviously, there are factors relating to the history of the countries and all that kind of stuff as well. But one of the key things that we found was, well, firstly, that actually journalists invariably are motivated by positive reasons. So you should all feel optimistic about that. Journalism is not something which is designed to try and make people angry and scared. Journalists are trying to do a good job. They're trying to help democracies to function effectively. They're trying to help people to make reasonable decisions. And journalists tend to have a strong sense that what they're doing is of value. And that's great. But there's a negative side to this whole thing, which is that journalists are also human beings. And they're affected by all kinds of factors that shape the way that they talk about subjects, complicated subjects like migration, not least of which is what the national narrative has been and is at any given point in time, what history tells us about that country, but also the commercial pressures of selling content in a competitive environment, whether or not governments are interfering. Obviously, we've seen in places like Hungary a lot more government interference on the issue of migration in recent times. Their own personal biases. Robert, you were very good about identifying your own. But also the cultures that exist within newsrooms. I mean, whether or not it's an aggressive place to work, whether or not whether or not getting a standout front page story is what decides whether or not you're being successful, or whether or not backing off when a story maybe doesn't stand up is important too. But also perceptions of whether or not editors have biases of their own, and not necessarily the editors expressing those biases directly. And when I say editors, I mean editors and proprietors as well. But actually journalists work to deliver something to their bosses. And if they imagine that their bosses have a certain conception about what is an important story and what sells, then that affects the kind of stories that they produce. And we found this quite, if you'd like to, the Reminder project provides a lot more detail and analysis on this. Now, All of this is also within the context of a fundamental challenge in modern society, and I illustrate this with a quote from Edward Bernays, who, if you haven't come across him, is a guy who saw himself as the father of modern public relations, a super interesting guy, and somebody who believed that freedom, actually, in a democratic society, is something that is broadly expressed through your right to persuade people of your position on things, which is an interesting and reasonable way of conceiving freedom, I think, in a democracy. But the problem with this is that battles are, essentially, when you create a marketplace of ideas, you create winners and losers, and you also create debates which do damage as well as debates that do good. The photograph that goes with this is from a Lucky Strike cigarettes campaign, which Edward Bernays was responsible for, which was designed to encourage women in America to smoke cigarettes by using essentially feminist ideas, that it was a torch of freedom that they should carry. And we are involved consistently in battles of ideas in the modern world. Now, I would like to argue, to conclude what I'm going to talk about, that actually one of the key problems that we face is that by participating in battles of ideas where the frames and the ways that we talk about these complicated issues are created by people with an agenda to push something else, creates a problem, and that we need to start to bridge the gaps between public policy making, media, academia, and until we can actually recognize that these aren't three separate components of policy making, but in fact one trinity that, if it does not work together, will be significantly problematic. We will always fail to deliver effective solutions to migration problems, whatever, or effective outcomes for migrants. Not just for migrants, but for a number of other subjects as well. So I think it's super important that we recognize that journalists need to see that they are part of the policy-making process. Academics need to see that they're part of the policy-making process. And policymakers need to recognize that both of those players are important parts of the policy-making process. We all inform each other, we amplify things, we can reduce the volume as well, and we don't necessarily need to fight problematic narratives by producing facts. I think facts are a critical part of dealing with problematic narratives, but we can also do it by having different conversations. Okay, and that's me. Thank you very much.
I'm going to offer you a rare opportunity, and that's to criticize a journalist. Good. But are we reflecting or amplifying the problems?
It's a complicated question. I think it is important that journalism is allowed to operate and to do what it does. What I think is an issue is whether or not journalism is reflective of itself. I think journalism is very good at pointing out other people's failings and the flaws of government, the flaws of academia, the flaws of public debate in all kinds of different ways. It's not so good at looking at itself and wondering whether or not what it's doing is helpful, or seeing itself. And I say itself, I mean journalists themselves, they consider themselves to be impartial observers. You are not an impartial observer. If you're participating in a debate, if you're pushing a line in one way or another, encouraging people to understand a subject in one way or another, you are a participant in that debate. So it can be either. I mean, it can be shining light on something, or it can be amplifying a negative message. But I would argue that what journalism needs to do is to sometimes recognize that it is a critical part of the problems and the solutions. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. I mean, I think what you're saying, and you're being kind about it, is that sometimes we're thin-skinned about criticism, and I would parry back that we don't have any skin. We're no skin. So we are very, very badly at criticizing ourselves. So I welcome your intervention. I'm going to turn now to Abel Chikanda from the University of Kansas. Please, Abel, let's welcome Abel.
Well, thank you. I am going to talk about xenophobia and how it has affected immigrant entrepreneurs who operate businesses in the informal economy. In May 2008, an estimated 62 people were killed in one of the largest outbreaks of xenophobic violence in South Africa. There were reports of widespread damage to property owned by foreign nationals. A report by XenoWatch shows that a total of 2,200 immigrant-owned shops were looted between 1998 and 2018. Unfortunately, xenophobic violence against African immigrants has become a commonplace, common phenomenon throughout South Africa. The United Nations, it has used the term xenophobia to describe the attitudes, prejudices, and behavior that reject, exclude, and often vilify persons based on the perception that they are outsiders or foreigners to the community, society, or national identity. Immigrant-owned businesses are frequently portrayed by officials, citizens, and the media as having a negative impact on the South African economy in that they undermine the livelihoods of South Africans. The prevalence of such perceptions, it helped to explain a growing xenophobic sentiments against immigrants and refugees. So in a bid to counter some of these negative stereotypes that are associated with foreigners, especially those that operate these informal businesses, the Southern African Migration Program, with funding from the IDRC, it conducted research in Cape Town between 2014 and 2015 to examine the contribution made by immigrants and refugees to the South African economy. So our reasoning was that by demonstrating the positive contributions that immigrants and refugees make to the South African economy, we might make the South African citizens view these individuals in good light. So some of these attacks on immigrants, they are fueled by stereotypes and myths that are perpetrated through the popular media. And one of the myths is that African immigrants, they lack valid immigration status, that is, they are undocumented immigrants. So our research findings, they show that contrary to popular belief, most African immigrants have a legal right to be in South Africa and to run a business. Only 7.4% are undocumented immigrants. And the second myth that we addressed in the study was that African immigrants, they are bad for the South African economy. And our research, it showed that immigrant entrepreneurs, they pay rent to either the local city council or to South African landlords. And the average rent that they paid per month was around $220. And for our sample, we administered a questionnaire to about 518 respondents. So for our sample, that translated to about $80,000 that was brought in by those immigrant entrepreneurs, or nearly $1 million per year. So we see that these immigrant entrepreneurs and refugees, they actually play a big role in South Africa's economy. And furthermore, our research, it found that most immigrant entrepreneurs source their goods from local suppliers and therefore support South African manufacturing, and they also promote job creation. And the third myth that we addressed was that the immigrant entrepreneurs, they take away jobs from South Africans. Our research findings, they show that immigrant entrepreneurs, they play an important role in employment creation. The immigrant entrepreneurs from our sample created a total of 644 jobs, including family employment. So some, they say that we shouldn't count family employment. So if we exclude family employment, that gives us about nearly 500 jobs, which for our sample translates to about one non-family job created per immigrant entrepreneur. So what it basically means is that every immigrant entrepreneur create one job for a non-family member. And as many as 57% of these jobs that were created, they went to South Africans. So they are creating employment for South Africans. And nearly 3/4 of the non-family jobs were full-time jobs. So despite the critical role that they play in the South African economy, xenophobia poses a serious threat to their business operations. So nearly half of our respondents, they say that their business operations have been affected by xenophobia. So where a migrant comes from, it appears to influence how susceptible their business operations are to xenophobia. And on a rather disturbing note, when these instances of violence, say when they have had their shops looted, when they have been beaten, so when they report these instances to the police, to local law enforcement, nothing is done at all. So in conclusion, systematic research is required in order to counter some of these negative stereotypes on African immigrants in South African society. And our research demonstrates that rather than being a drain to the South African economy, African immigrants and refugees play a positive role in South Africa's economy and society. Thank you.
Abel, I'm afraid you win the dubious prize of presenting the most sobering research, I think, so far. It's disconcerting. And one of the things in your research that I found particularly sobering is the fact that the xenophobia is institutionalized, as you said, media, government officials, police. If that's the case, if it seems to be bred in the DNA of institutions, I'm going to try to do a little jujitsu and ask you to give us some hope. What steps do you think need to be taken in order to take some of that DNA and change it in these institutions?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer. Because yeah, because right now, if you look at even what's going on in South African society, you'll find that it comes right from the very top. Even the politicians themselves, they've been complicit in this particular issue. They utter irresponsible public statements. Just 2 years ago, one public official from the city of Joburg called for all the immigrants to be deported from South Africa, accusing them of being criminals and so forth. So, but there is a bit of hope. A month or so ago, there was a document that was produced by the South African government. It's called the National Action Plan. So what this National Action Plan seeks to do is to create some kind of a forum where the government and civil society work together to combat xenophobia. So they are in the process of laying out the framework of how that can be done. So we can only hope that something positive would come out of the whole thing. And I'm a little bit skeptical even over this, this National Action Plan, because they say that we just want to have an internal dialogue first. And if you look at the timelines involved here, they say that they need about 5 years to come up with a plan which they would present to the South African public. And every day that passes by, there is at least one bad incident of xenophobic violence that's directed at these, to these immigrants and also refugees. So that's the way it is right now.
I was hoping for more hope, but I'll take what you've got on offer. Next, I would like to call on Diana Zavala Rojas from the University of Pompu, Fabia. Did I do that well, or Fabra? There you go. Please, welcome Diana, please.
Bonjour, bonjour. Bonjour, Madame et Messieurs. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité. Je vais passer à l'anglais pour m'exposer. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me. Part of my job as a scientist is about designing, gathering, and analyzing reliable data about social and political phenomena, especially in Europe. And in this data, narratives about immigration are very salient. And these narratives we see that shape public opinions. So in these 5 minutes, I want to tell you what unmasking means to me. I want to revise key terms to understand not only the European context, but more broadly, how we measure attitudes towards immigration and how data and science, scientific concepts can help us to fight negative narratives. So if I give you the picture from Europe, especially from the media, this picture is not good. Current narratives about immigration range from open government violence against immigrants to criminalization of social civic solidarity efforts. So despite the problems that we see here in Canada and that we have heard throughout this conference, I can tell you that comparatively you're doing well. It is still an outlier that has a different vision and a different understanding of what migration means. So it is important to understand that these narratives that we hear in the media all the time that shape attitudes are sometimes not do not rely on data, but are magnify about events. And these narratives shape the attitudes, and attitudes shape behavior. So first keywords here are narratives and attitudes. But who are immigrants in the European context? In the European context are people who come and live here from other countries. And here refers to a country, but country is a very abstract thing when you ask people. So that means that they answer about their immediate context and neighborhood. And in Europe, other countries mean migration from north to south, from south to north, and from east to west. So we are also talking about white-to-white migration, white-to-white countries migration. So what is an attitude? I brought here a very old framework from the 60s, but that is still very valid. An attitude has a cognitive component, a feeling component, and an action tendency component. So cognition means that I know something about immigrants or migration, or that I have heard narratives about them. And again, in this sense, Canada is doing well because you're promoting contact. And research repeatedly says that negative attitudes are fought with contact. People should contact immigrants. Otherwise, what they have are the narratives. They don't know people, but they actually know information they consume from basically everywhere. Then these narratives or this contact create feelings. I reject or accept this, I fear, or I have a sense of social realization and social meaningful also of belonging to a place and to expanding this community. And this can lead to both action tendencies, negative or positive, depending what you have. Negative, I have here Brexit vote, that migration has been said to be a trigger of this, of Brexit vote. But also, again, like the examples I've seen in Canada, it can create positive action tendency, such as the amazing network of social organizations that you have that are working directly with newcomers, and the amazing network of volunteers you have. I have to stress that as a really positive thing that is framing attitudes here. So, you know, we measure attitudes typically with survey research, but how reliable is this data? So I bring here today just an example. We have a long time series in around 30 European countries, 35 languages of to what extent do you think the Netherlands, Spain, Great Britain should allow people of the same race or ethnic group, this might mean other Europeans, as much as people to come and live here. Then we ask the same thing about different race and about poor countries outside Europe. And the basic categories are allow many, some few known, and we sometimes just recall these categories. So this is the very diverse picture I have in this example from Europe. You can see there that Hungary stands always as probably the least welcoming country, and it is something really nice to see here, because you see that supposedly different countries that receive more immigrants are more open to them. So the first two bars means 2004 and 2014, both about a different race or ethnic group. And the bars to the left, to the right, sorry, means again 2004 and 2014 for a different, for the same race and ethnic group. So it's different and same. And this is just data before the crisis and just after the economic crisis. So I'm not talking now about this supposedly new research in negative attitudes. We manipulated this data because we know that self-reported measures can be not really reliable due to social desirability. And I want to show you this that we arrived through experiments. So the points at the top means the open questions. So how many they think they should allow some immigrants in their countries, and the figures look amazing. So Europe looks really like welcoming at that time, before the new supposedly cold crisis. But the second level of points shows us that in anonymity conditions, this welcoming goes down a little bit. And through experimental research, we see the lowest points there, in which these questions were gathered totally anonymous answers. Then the attitudes towards immigration, specifically in this example in the Netherlands, are terrible. So the biggest difference is in the same race. What does this mean? That in these new years, European societies have become less welcoming? Or that, for instance, Hungary has always been very honest, saying that they don't want any immigrants? So, concluding, are really attitudes toward immigration growing in the negative sense? Likely yes or likely no. Likely it has been more socially acceptable saying that we don't want newcomers anymore. And this has huge implications for policymakers. And then my message here for you, especially for those who work with communities, is to listen, welcoming communities. Because it may be the case that these fears are latent there, and that they are just appearing with narratives creating aside with the migration issues. So we have to be very careful to listen to communities. But again, I think you're doing good in this respect. So thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Let's hear from you. Deanna, I'm not going to allow Rob to have all the fun. I'm going to allow you to criticize me and journalists as well. Yesterday we had a brief conversation, and I used the word crisis to describe what was happening on the issue of immigration in Europe, and I was referring to 2015, but you quickly upbraided me with the verbal equivalent of a sharp, short blow to the back of the skull. Can you tell me whether or not there is a crisis in immigration in Europe?
Data says there is no crisis. So it is true that inflows grew, especially from the Syrian crisis, and the crisis is a war. The crisis is not that new people is coming. And we heard this in a very nice keynote speech this week. So crisis, what does crisis mean, actually? Crisis mean that people have to flee away because of the war. Then I say yes, there is a crisis. But what our data says is that actually inflows of immigration are not from countries outside Europe. So we have a lot of immigration from European countries, north to south, south to north, and east to west. So, and these figures have become stable through time. And actually what happened after the crisis is that many non-Europeans went back to their countries of origin. This happened a lot in Spain. Migration figures just lower, but it was not that Spain was not welcoming them, it's what that people was going back to their country of origin.
Syria might be an example of that, right? As the civil war begins to wind down, people might be going back to Syria. It's interesting to note that in Canada, and again I will declare my bias, I was part of a group that sponsored a Syrian refugee family. Syrians are choosing to stay here in vast numbers, which is quite interesting. I am going to ask some general questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to the floor for Q&A, but I want to invite everybody to address some of these issues if you want to, and if you don't, feel free. I want to touch on something that Rob mentioned, because he gave excellent historic context about immigration. Has there ever been enthusiasm recently throughout history for large-scale immigration into a country? Anybody want to take that on? Yes, please, go ahead.
Definitely. There are several countries who have been historically receiving societies in Europe, for instance. Spain, Germany, inclusive Scandinavian countries, after they incorporated all women to the labor force. So, yeah, and UK as well, of course.
Anybody else? Yes, please, go ahead, Keith.
A challenging part of your question is that if you go back over history, measurement of enthusiasm is a little more difficult because the concept of public opinion is relatively recent.
Right. I did think Rob captured it.
Yes, enthusiastic by who? Yeah. I think very briefly in Canada, certainly in the mid to late 19th, early 20th century, there was a lot of immigration to Canada, to fill up the West and so forth. And it was immigration for certain countries. European, largely white, and so forth. So I don't know if there was enthusiasm, but I think that there was probably a general sense that this was important or necessary and okay because there was lots of land, and these people were similar. They were white, I guess, and they were going somewhere else. So I suspect that it was not an issue in Canada and probably more positive than negative.
So I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way, which is that the challenge to some extent is about who would or wouldn't be enthusiastic, because countries aren't sort of homogenous. I mean, different people have different perspectives on things. But what I think is quite clear is that throughout history, immigration control has been focused on limiting the movement of the poor. And research by one of my colleagues from Compass, who's actually now moved to the University of Bristol, a woman called Bridget Anderson, dealt with the creation of the very first, essentially passports, travel documents, means of kind of identifying people based on who they were and whether or not they had permission to be in one place or another, which was from the medieval period in the UK. and was looking at the fact that, and these were documents that were provided to what were called valiant beggars, but they were basically poor people to say you can or cannot go to another parish and ply your trade, beg for money, whatever it is that you want to do there. But that fundamental thing about the kind of the control of the mobility of the poor is a key thing, because I don't think, generally speaking, there's not a lot of reticence on the part of most countries to accept rich people. It's actually when you're dealing with poorer people that you come up against problems and reticence.
Please, Abel.
I think in the case of South Africa, the answer would be a hard no, especially on the case of, on the side of South Africans. But you would say that there's been enthusiasm on the part of the government. If you are to look at, say, the apartheid era, that the government, they used immigration as a way of meeting labor needs in certain sectors of the economy. So in the early 19th and 20th century, they imported South Asian labor to work in the sugarcane plantations in the KwaZulu-Natal province. And then later on, there was organized labor to the South African mines and also to the South African farms. So in that case, you'd find that they were using immigration as a way of meeting the labor needs of the economy, because these were basically occupations that the black South Africans were not interested in. They fit in the 3D category, and they were not interested in those. So an important, especially point to note, especially about what was happening at that time, was that these individuals, they didn't interact a lot with the local population. So they were working in the farms, they were working in the mines, so they didn't mix a lot with the local population. But then after the end of apartheid, when those influx control measures fell, you'd find that there was a large-scale immigration of people into South Africa. And even the research that was conducted by the Southern African Migration Program, it showed that xenophobia in South Africa it rose in the immediate aftermath of the end of apartheid, that black South Africans, they felt that these individuals, black South Africans, were coming in to steal the fruits of apartheid, that we fought against apartheid, and now that we are free, you'd find that these individuals, they are coming from countries that have a longer history of independence. They were the black Africans. They had higher levels of education, and they were able to get good jobs that were that had been vacated, especially by the white South Africans who were living the post-apartheid state, who were not interested in living under black rule. So I think, in short, there's never been enthusiasm, especially on immigration-related issues. Black Africans, they have always been associated with various stereotypes, chief of which is that they come to steal our jobs.
Very interesting. Let me ask the group again another question. It seems that, particularly industrialized countries, that authoritarian populists who are anti-immigrant are succeeding politically. If you are somebody who is trying to go the other way, what does a successful politician campaigning in favor of immigration have to do according to the research you're doing? And I'm going to start with Neil, because we haven't heard from you. And you're dealing with a particular issue in your country right now in the United States, where I see from the Democratic debates that there are arguments being made in favor of immigration.
I think first I'll go to the first and then answer your second question. For the U.S., as Keith said, we don't have public attitudes. Pew Research Center didn't exist back in 1965 when there was a major change in immigration system in the United States. people have to remember historically, before 1965, the U.S. banned actually countries from being able to immigrate to the U.S., especially from Latin America and Asia. And only 4.7% of the population was foreign born in the U.S. in 1965. But then it now is actually quite historic. It's about almost 14% of the U.S. population is foreign born. So I think that that's the context that we have this political debate. But going into populism, I think we did research in Europe looking at populist attitudes. And one thing that we've discovered is that it's not really confined to right or left, or it's actually quite interesting when we kind of see who is actually populist. And people with populist views, what they have in common is that they're dissatisfied with traditional institutions. They're dissatisfied with traditional media. They're dissatisfied with traditional political institutions. So those are the people that we're talking about who are tend to also be anti-immigrant. So I don't have a solution in terms of how do you convince people with populist attitudes, but I think that those are the people that we're thinking about. And maybe thinking about what are the other media outlets or the alternatives or social media, other things that people go for their information that shape their attitudes. So that's still a puzzle and a question that we still need to understand.
Deanna, go ahead.
I would say two things. Listening to communities, to receiving communities, because if political parties or politicians willing to accept immigrants don't go there at the very, very local level, then people is just listening to the broad context given in the media for this very abstract thing that is the country. But in fact, people are really worried about their neighborhood, their schools, their towns, their streets, their pensions. So go to the community level. Second thing, contact. There's some research from Kew West in London that says that even imagined contact is working. So if you put people in a room and say, imagine that this person is coming from wherever, and you engage in a story, and you engage in this humanization of migrants, in this taking out the labels, that is proven to work.
Anybody else? Keith, yes, go ahead.
Let me build up. Can you hear me? Testing.
There you go.
Yes. Let me build on that a bit. I think contact definitely makes a difference, but I think the other point that can effectively be made, and we see this in Canada, is to help inform and assure the native population that many immigrants actually want to be like them and they want to integrate. And not only are they humans like the native born, but they actually want to be part of that country and they don't want to be distinct. Our research in Canada showed, for instance, that non-Muslims felt that most Muslims wanted to stay very distinct in their own enclaves and their own culture. But when we asked Muslims, their aspiration, and most of them were immigrants, was to become like other Canadians. And I think that, so certainly in the Canadian context, most immigrants are actually doing their part. When they come to this country, they're not expected to give up their culture and their roots and so forth, and that's a positive. But many of them are motivated and work hard to actually become Canadian in certain ways. We've asked a question on a couple of surveys, an open-ended question: what do you expect immigrants to do when they come to this country? And we asked immigrants and non-immigrants, and it was open-ended. And both groups basically gave the same answer. It's respect the law, it's tolerance for others, and so forth. So, but I think this is something that most Native people don't understand or don't see, and they need to appreciate that immigrants are actually wanting to become part of it. And so I think the contact is part of the answer to that, so you meet people. But just to broadly appreciate the fact that, in fact, immigrants may look different and have different traditions, but in fact, when they come to a new country, in many cases, they want to be part of that country.
Please.
Yeah. So, as you might have gathered from my presentation, I think one of the most valuable things you can do is to try to reduce the temperature of debates. And for organizations who are involved in advocacy on an issue, it can be quite challenging to not respond consistently to calumnies that get thrown out there with myth busting and efforts to try and shoot down sort of somebody's point. But actually, when you engage in these things, often you're actually just repeating that calumny in the first place and encouraging people to think about those things. And also just feeding a narrative of, this is a problem, there's two sides of this debate, these guys are saying that, these guys are saying that, and just having a fight about it. So I think trying to actually, I think we've seen in the UK what happens when you do reduce that temperature. I don't know how long it's going to last, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's going to suddenly change completely, but I think that there is something fundamental that also happened at a strategic moment within what has been going on in the UK for a little while, which I didn't mention in my presentation, which was that while we've seen this big decline in the salience of the issue of migration, and that has seemingly fed into a perception that migration is not such a big deal, not such a problem, it's quite a mundane, ordinary thing and quite good, which we've seen from Neil's data as well. We also saw something happen at the same time, or in fact it was last year, in the middle of this whole thing, which is what was described as the Windrush scandal in the UK. I don't know how much visibility that got outside the UK, but that was a situation where the British government was found to have been depriving fundamental rights, such as healthcare, and also potentially deporting as well, people who'd come to the UK specifically from Caribbean countries, but also from other Commonwealth countries as British citizens in the years before 1971. So they had full rights to remain in the UK, but a lot of these people had come as poor people working in menial jobs and actually had never acquired a passport, a British passport, had never left the UK. So even though they had come with those rights, they ended up in a situation where they were unable to prove their long-term rights to remain in the UK when the government's hostile environment came in. The hostile environment. So all I was going to say was that process, the shock that was felt by the British public about the fact that these people were being prevented from accessing healthcare, the British people who'd lived in the country for 50 years, came at a time when people were already open to the idea that migration was not such a bad thing, and also that this concept, this hostile environment concept, was significantly problematic. And so the rhetoric that had driven British public debate on migration for a long time was shot to pieces. So I would say that where there are opportunities to actually capture a moment and build on it. So when there is positive sentiment about migration, ensure that you capitalize on that, build on it further. And where there is negative sentiment, maybe actually just try and turn the temperature down a little bit. I'm not sure how coherent that was, but yeah.
Okay, so I would like to emphasize the point that was made by Keith, that in this whole debate, you find that the human element, it's lacking. So in the case of South Africa, when it comes to xenophobia, there is no distinction between, say, economic immigrants and refugees. So they are all regarded as refugees. So in our case, the research that we conducted, we actually find that about 2/3 of those individuals who run the informal businesses that are being subjected to xenophobia, they are actually living in South Africa on humanitarian grounds. So I think a useful entry point would be for the government to even recognize the fact that South Africa, it is offering refuge to these individuals, and also have South Africans, ordinary South Africans, take that as a source of pride. So the reason that I'm alluding to that fact is that during the apartheid era, South Africans, a large number of South Africans were housed in other countries in Southern Africa. So if there is that discussion, at least, that we are helping our colleagues who are in whose countries are undergoing political disturbances, you find that yeah, it would in a way lessen even these instances of violence. And the other quick point that I would like to make is that reforming even the way that we talk about refugees, especially immigrants in the media, might also go a long way. So you find that when we talk about the entry of these individuals, aquatic metaphors, they are usually used that, yeah, we have a flow of immigrants, we are flooded with immigrants, we are swarmed, they are coming in waves and so forth. So, and again, even us as researchers, sometimes when we present our findings, we do use those aquatic metaphors. So to an ordinary individual, when they hear such words, they do have that feeling that our country is actually being overrun by immigrants and so forth. So we have to take action against these individuals.
Thank you. And I am beginning to accumulate lumps on behalf of my media colleagues. But some of them are well earned. I want to turn this over to people in the crowd, and if I'm not wrong, Enrico, you're pointing me to questions from. I can pick any one. You're giving me awesome powers. Well, why don't we start off the top? Have your studies ever analyzed the sentiment of intolerance of visible minorities among themselves in regards to immigrants arriving in Western countries? I can tell you the CBC has a poll coming on that will touch on that, but that's a very good question. Yes, go ahead, Keith.
Sorry.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I don't have a definitive answer in Canada, but on many of our national surveys now, we always look at the results of first generation and second generation on issues like immigration and so forth. And I think, broadly speaking, not surprisingly, first generation Canadians, those who have come from another country, on average tend to be a bit more positive about immigrants and refugees overall. And second generation are sort of between first generation and others. So I think, broadly speaking, I think there's a difference, and it would make sense. I think within specific groups, it's a more complicated picture, and I think certainly there is some negative views across various kinds of groups. Here you're cross-country, both ethnicity and religion. I think Muslims, people uncomfortable with Muslims are not simply non-Muslims overall across the board, but people from other ethnic groups. So it's a bit of a nuanced issue, but broadly speaking in Canada, immigrants, first and second generation, do tend to be much more supportive.
Go ahead, Neil. Yeah.
So we did a couple of surveys. One, we asked Latinos in the United States, those who were Hispanic origin, about whether they think there's too many immigrants or fewer immigrants, or about they want the same amount. And we've noticed that actually, back in 2002, about almost a majority of Hispanics actually thought there were too many immigrants. But then now it actually has kind of decreased. Only about a quarter of Hispanics in the U.S. actually think there's too many immigrants. But going back at the question about in terms of visible minorities, at Pew we did do surveys on race, which is actually quite disheartening, at least in the United States. We did a race survey that was quite controversial that was released this spring, and it really showed the majority of Hispanics, Asians, and African Americans have experienced discrimination within the last couple of years, so it's actually quite visible. 75% of Asians and blacks actually have experienced discrimination, where it's 58% of Hispanics. So that's some of our, in terms of our race findings.
And did that research show any strains of intolerance among those groups themselves towards other visible minorities?
In that, we didn't ask that question.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me go to Violet's question, since she was courageous enough to put her name on the question. None of the panelists referenced the role of leadership, and in particular political leadership, in inflaming or dousing anti-immigrant sentiments. Thoughts? So I have a question like that, which is, does your research tell you why authoritarian populists who are opposed to immigration are successful? Why? Sure, sure.
I'm going to address the question on the screen.
Sure.
I think leadership is really critical, and both positive and negative. And I think that part of what leadership does is it helps establish or reinforce social norms. And I think norms are really pretty essential. Norms are not necessarily what you think personally, but what you understand is acceptable in society. And I would actually argue that ultimately social norms are more important than attitudes. And whatever somebody may feel internally about immigrants or visible minorities is one thing. How they feel that what's acceptable to act in public is actually probably more important. Civil society. And people may feel uncomfortable personally, but if they act in a civil way, I think ultimately that's more important. And leadership and leaders are there to help either establish or reinforce the norms. If they do that effectively, that's a very positive effect. But if they come in to drive wedges and they're trying to dissemble that, then that's very destructive.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
So I think thinking about my own experience of the leadership in the UK over the last 10 years or so in dealing with migration, it's been very, very evident that a populist choice that was made in 2008, 2009 by the Conservative Party to focus on a specific target of reducing net migration to the tens of thousands had a massive impact on public concerns about the issue, because it created an idea that there was a quantifiable right amount of migration into the UK. And not only did it do that, but it also did it in a way which was undeliverable. There was no way that they were going to get to that number. It played well briefly for the Conservative Party in that it got them elected in 2010, and it was helpful in getting them re-elected in 2015, even though they were substantially missing the target already by then. But it created the idea of a problem. So there was high net migration over that period of time, and there are all kinds of, you can argue whether or not it should have been higher or lower as much as you'd like, but the idea that there was a right amount and that the government was failing to deliver this right amount was fundamental in shaping the British public idea that immigration was out of control, and that the idea that that not only was it out of control, but that there were sections of it that we had no control over at all, specifically European Union free movement, which allowed people to come and live in the UK. And that was, I would argue, the defining factor that meant that we ended up voting to leave the European Union. Other people might disagree with that, but I think that that's certainly how it appeared from the outside. So the overall outcome of that as well was to lead to a spike in xenophobic attacks on people, a massive outflow now of Eastern European migrants who are moving back to their home countries. That may also be for economic reasons, because since Brexit we've seen the collapse in the value of the pound, or since the referendum we've seen a collapse in the value of the pound. But nevertheless, I would argue that leadership, that a poor populist choice, something that was designed to win elections at a specific point in time without really delivering anything other than just shouty anti-migration rhetoric, was disastrous for Britain.
I know we're tight for time, but I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask a question that I think is quite pertinent to us here in Canada and to some people abroad as well. Somebody please say something about where Indigenous peoples fit into this discussion. We in Canada are having a large national discussion now about the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada over the last several hundred years, and I wonder if people might be able to talk about that in the Canadian sense and in the global sense. Very good. But can we get the answers to the, yes, please go ahead.
Let me just speak briefly. This is a big issue, and I don't know that we can do justice in the short time that we have. I think that the success, I guess, or the positive aspects of welcoming immigrants to this country does not apply to relations with Indigenous people. These are really very distinct issues. I would describe relations in Canada with Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous as very fraught. I think there's progress. I think but there are many unresolved issues, and I think in many ways the Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, have more difficulty with Indigenous peoples and some of those issues than they do with immigrants. So it's a much more challenging issue. I know Indigenous peoples are very resentful about being lumped in with ethnic immigrants and so forth, and sometimes that happens in the media and sometimes that happens in the public. I think there's some good news, but I think it's different and distinct set of issues that has a longer way to go.
A question from the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Linda Ocho from the African Migration and Development Policy Center. I have 3 questions. 2 are for all the panelists, and the last one's for Abel Chikanda. So the first one is to talk about media's responsibility when they're reporting on migration data. I'm wondering if there's a strategy or policy or something in place that ensures that the media are referring to the right evidence and in the right way. Do they receive training alongside that? The second question, as organizations, have you come across a situation where media has misused your data to sort of create a negative perception on migrants, immigrants that are coming to the country? And then what have you done about it? And then for Abel, my question is, how has xenophobia affected foreign investment in South Africa? Thank you.
I must say, Linda, that you would make a good journalist. You managed to squeeze 3 questions into one. That was quite adept. Please take on Linda's questions.
If I could just quickly say on the question of media's responsibility is a very difficult one, because media have multiple different responsibilities, including often selling products, but also, I mean, journalists don't do what they do just to get paid. They do what they do because they believe in it, which is one of the things that I was talking about before. But there are also, I mean, the idea that we can regulate the way that people deal with an issue, or that we should try to regulate the way that people deal with an issue, starts to get into some very difficult and messy territory very quickly. However, there are tools that are available to journalists. For example, I mean, only a couple of days ago, the Ethical Journalism Network produced a toolkit for journalists dealing with the issue of migration. And one of the outputs that we're going to be producing from the Reminder project is also going to be a similar kind of means of guiding people towards suitable, useful ways of interpreting data, finding useful data. So there are things out there, but journalists tend not to be super keen on being told how to report on things, and I think that I respect that. I don't think that journalists should be told how to report on things. I think that journalists, again, need to be reflexive and think about whether or not they are doing things correctly, or if there are different ways of understanding things. But journalists need to have, in a society where we value and cherish people's right to have different opinions and to do things in different ways, we need to give journalists freedom to report on issues in ways that we maybe disagree with. So I think that that's key. I will pass on the mic. Sorry.
Abel.
Yeah, so I will respond to the last question that you asked, how xenophobia has affected foreign investment in South Africa. Unfortunately, we haven't looked into that, but it's something that one can easily do, because there is data that's available from various organizations such as XenoWatch and so forth. It actually gives you a timeline of these events. So whenever there is an incident, a reported instance of xenophobic violence, they record it on their website, and they actually produce a report every month that details these instances of violence. So if it's something that's of interest to you, it's quite easy for one to obtain, say, data on foreign investment in South Africa. So if you go back in time and then you're collecting all the data, and then you can actually correlate it with data on xenophobic violence in South Africa to see if there is any correlation between the two. But what I can only say is that whenever there is, say, an outbreak of xenophobic violence, it actually creates this negative picture, especially amongst investors. So one could argue that any episodes of xenophobic violence might have an impact on foreign investment. Okay, thank you.
I want to begin by, again, thanking our hosts. I want you to thank this illustrious panel. I've learned a great deal. Please thank them. Thank all of you. And I want to thank you for coming to Ottawa, and I wish you a wonderful stay and safe travels home. The work you do now and are doing has never been more important. Please continue to do it. Thank you.